We are live now. We're currently talking about football. We'll come back to that at some point in time. Let me introduce. It's Paul Comben, artist, wargamer, author. What other titles should I put in for you, Paul?
I think that's quite enough in there.
I loved your. You've really had a lot going on the artist front here lately.
Yeah, well, I've started off. Got a lovely surprise yesterday when I got some newspaper coverage for a show I'm taking part in. Beautiful. It's a group of local artists in my part of northwest England, and we're all showing together. And my painting got chosen as the one that would headline the article. So that was great.
I'm going to go pop out our chat screen. If you want, feel free to let's talk a little bit more about that while I'm fiddling around here.
Okay, well, I have had a bit of a break from exhibiting paintings for quite a long while now. It isn't easy finding gallery space. I kind of felt that it was best to have a hiatus, think about what I wanted to paint, anything that I could do that would be different in terms of how I presented my work. But I've just got back into it now, and it seems to be a good time. We went through in this country a period of, economic restraint, shall we say, and people just didn't have money to spend on paintings. And a few years back, I had a lot of paintings at the Edinburgh Art Fair, which is one of the big events in Britain. And yeah, people came along and looked at it, but they were just looking as if they were walking around a museum. There wasn't any real intention to buy, which is no good to us at all, really. So it feels different now. And I'm hoping that I can kickstart with a few sales in the not too distant future.
Beautiful. And we've already got Trevor Just is in. Sorry, Trevor. I was literally going into the chat screen to pop it out so I could see it. He says, hey, all, and he's tuning in from San Jose, California.
Hello there.
Thanks for being in, Trevor. Trevor's a great fan. He's been around for a while. So the main topic we're going to talk about today is the actual controversies that surround our board game, war game hobby. So this isn't online games or war games via the computer. This is literally board gaming in the wargaming genre. Now, Paul, you had some great deep thoughts on this. I've got even what I'll probably say are emotional views and thoughts on this. And I've had, I think twice, once at a convention and once just via online, where someone contacted me or talked to me and they were uncomfortable themselves with the idea of people playing war games. Why don't you open us up with some of your thoughts?
Okay, well, I think probably of all the controversy we can talk about today, the one that people will most readily understand is this notion that we trivialize war, death and suffering by playing games about it. And it's partly the association that a lot of people have with the notion of game, that a game is a happy event that you sit around a table, have a few laughs and play a game of Monopoly and move your boot and your top hat around the board.
Perfect.
Well, we can't help that term. That's a term that we've got. But I think the standard response that you can give to this is these are very detailed models of historical events. They look at the workings of history. They can give you that insight into how history operates and why certain things happen, why other things could have happened on a different day. But really, what I wanted to get to by way of putting my foot through the door straight away is we know those arguments about the historical model, the seriousness of the hobby and the educational value of the hobby. They're there for people to see. So what I wanted to kind of get on the front foot with is, for me, the disrespect that can arise in society towards death and suffering in war is not from war gamers. It's from people who really have no appreciation whatsoever of what men and women of valor have done in the deep past or in the more recent past or in the present by way of serving and suffering and going through the privations associated with the realities of combat. Unfortunately, in my country, I think that there are probably more people than there used to be, that if you ask them, and you've got the Battle of Britain there in the background as one of the games on show, if you ask them the simple question, when was that fought? When did that occur? I'm afraid that there'd be quite a lot of people who would not be able to give you an accurate answer. I could say, well, Battle of Naseby, Battle of Marston Moor, which war were they part of? Again, I'd probably get blank faces. And I dare say you might find the same with certain events, key events in American history, from, you know, when was Guilford Courthouse and when was Saratoga through to Gettysburg? Can you point on a map and tell me where Chickamauga was? That is what I feel is a disregard for past sacrifice, not looking at history from the inside. Although, if we're honest about it, one thing that I felt as I was going through, you know, my own ideas for today is it's also full of grey areas. And if we try and present this, it's all dispassionate, we only play to enjoy the relish of enjoying history, we're probably fibbing a bit.
Sure.
Because there is that certain thrill, the enjoyment of organizing your Napoleonic cavalry charge, or you know, leading some tanks forward in the desert.
And a surprising turn, you know, you've the gaminess of it, where you might suck another player into your trap, and that's definitely, you know, and then the reversal, or they think they've got you, or maybe even a great die roll that suddenly boom, and now visually I can see this gallant thing that's really quite fictional, but it's set in this historic landscape. And so I agree with you 100%. I think those that enjoy history can find it almost like a living space that they can go in, or that I can transport myself into for a period of time.
Yes. I would, again, I would not be 100% genuine if I didn't admit that we do play for that relish of sanitized combat.
Yes.
But I do also feel that the disregard that comes, or the trivializing that comes regarding war experiences, does not come from wargaming. It is more deeper rooted in society than that. And it comes through sometimes a complete unawareness of what history has been made out of.
Right.
There's a reason why there's a fucking great big column in the middle of London with Nelson on the top of it. And it's more than simply he won the victory. It's also an embodiment of certain characteristics, certain values that we may think are important.
Right. Right. I think that's why soldiers or military men and women throughout time are kind of held up. It's the ultimate sacrifice kind of idea.
Yes, it is. And again, if I stay on this theme, that one of the things that we've had happen in my country in recent time is a certain amount of debate about the way in which we treat veterans. Now, there was a big case, big story in the news not very long ago at all about an SAS soldier, former SAS soldier, who had ended up sleeping in a car. He was homeless. And he was not given any sort of priority. There were issues with the way in which the local authority was handling the case, and it caused an immense stir of annoyance amongst people who felt that this is no way to treat someone who's put his life on the line. And that attitude is not going to come from a war gamer. It's going to come from those who, I dare say, would probably fancy themselves to be morally better than us, and they're not.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And we'll touch on it maybe a little bit later during the show. But I have actually, as a youth, I believe kind of like a good book or a great movie can touch you and change the way you think or feel. I've had board games do the same thing. So I'm also very a lot of times I'll point people toward, I've seen movies, Saving Private Ryan. It's not a perfect historically accurate movie, but it sure touches you into what the loss of war can be. So it does two things. It entertains and it educates and informs all at the same time. And books, the book actually, when I was in 6th grade, that captured me and made me an avid reader was a book called My Brother Sam is Dead. The Collier brothers wrote it, and it was all about the Revolutionary War and a son leaving and going off to fight. And then the story focuses on the younger brother who stays at home on the farm and what happens and some things there. And it's able to humanize the conflict. You know, when I was in 6th grade, I didn't know a lot about the Revolutionary War, and it taught me some things just by enjoying the read.
Yeah, there is this thing which I think I mentioned last time about the creative side of wargame design, or even of wargame play, that goes beyond the science of crunching numbers together. And it's interesting that you raise Saving Private Ryan, because I'm very mindful that there was another film that came out at more or less the same time and got lost in the shadows of Saving Private Ryan, which was A Thin Red Line. Now, those two films were very different in their approach to combat and to the realities of what different groups of American soldiers were going through in different theaters of the Second World War.
Right.
Both were, each in their own way, very valid treatments. One was a deeply philosophical film which looked at, you know, man and nature and the kind of nature of war entering into the world and how soldiers perceive that. And of course, the other one was about the harsh brutalities of conflict and combat, full stop. But both treatments were valid. And again, with our hobby and the way we approach games, two people are not going to approach the same subject the same way. Two designers won't. Where people pitch a treatment is very much to do with their own sensibilities.
I agree. We've got a comment too, and I just replied to from Trevor. Trevor says he has an age 6 boys and a 3-year-old girl. He's played Memoir 44 and Twilight Struggle with both boys, and I always explain things as we go. And I think that is definitely the teaching aspect, and both great games to show. And the philosophy that if you don't learn from history, I truly do believe you're doomed to repeat it.
Yeah, one of the things that's different about today for children who do enter the hobby at some level, when I was young, when I was 12, I mean, you basically played Avalon Hill in my country. You didn't really play anything.
Same.
Not until, and there weren't really entry-level games specifically designed in a way that would appeal to a younger person. You either kind of got grabbed by the notion of hex encounters, and if you didn't, there wasn't really anything else. Yes. But of course, now you've got the Commands and Colors, you've got Memoir, you've got Wings of Glory, and a whole range of stuff, which is going to have an appeal because it has got that visual look, which a child is probably more going to associate with fun than looking at stuff put out on a gridded map.
Right. Yeah. He's got a follow-up here. Trevor says he and his boys are actually at Pacificon right now this weekend. He's with his boys, and it is a wargaming convention. So, he's bringing it on further. I guess I've seen other media accused of glorifying war as well. Not so much books, but definitely movies. And I think there's a difference in that. Like, you didn't hear a lot of negative on Saving Private Ryan. Of course, Rambo and some of those, which are caricatures. It's just basically the hero's story is what you're really seeing. But I've always pointed out, even in that, if you look at the Rambo movies, yes, it's the hero story, but the very first movie dealt with the trauma of returning vets from Vietnam and how they were treated. And then, of course, it became a very popular franchise, and it kind of went into the cartoonish mythical character. So,
well, it's true. I mean, one of the things that I started off thinking when, again, I was trying to put some materials forward for this was, you know, this subject or that subject. Do we want this? Do we want that? Absolutely not. In some cases, you'd think. But then the grey areas come in and you think, well, there's more than one way of doing it. And do I really want to say at the end of the day that I believe that people should be allowed to interact with materials, especially if you live in a democracy?
Yes.
I'm supposed to live in a mature democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And we do get our hoo-has over particular things. And I'm afraid that sometimes I feel that we are not trusted to interact with stuff and then be able to park it afterwards.
100%.
Now, one film, if to stay with films one moment longer, a film that was made in my country only a few years ago, you would put it not so much in the context of a traditional war game, but it would certainly, you could relate it a little bit to something like Labyrinth. And that was a film called Four Lions. Now, Four Lions was a story about four radicalized Muslim people in Britain who decided to plant a bomb or launch a terror attack in London. Well, okay, you think, well, that's all right as an idea for a film. But of course, what made it really controversial was that it was a comedy.
Mm.
And I don't know if you've ever seen it.
I haven't.
You haven't. It's hilarious. It is, honestly, you could go in feeling, oh, well, this is not going to be a very funny film, or what a rotten subject to make a comedy out of. But it was incredibly perceptive. It was very well written, very well cast, very well performed. Now, some people still didn't like it. And my answer is, well, don't go and see it then. Leave it. If you don't, if no one's going to think the less of you if you don't want to go and see it, but please don't feel the less of me if I do want to go and see it, because it did have a very intelligent approach to very sensitive matter, and it added to this sense that I've got to toss aside these absolutes about we definitely don't want a game on this or we definitely don't want a game on that. We want intelligent treatments.
Mm-hmm.
Because I started off thinking, well, we absolutely don't want the trivializing of death and suffering. And just when I got pretty comfortable with that, I suddenly thought, well, what do I do with Heroes of Normandy?
Right.
Because at some key level, that game has its cartoon Nazis, it has its cartoon this and that. And you'd think, well, from a certain perspective, I'm trying to defend the hobby on the basis of, yes, it's very serious treatments, and it's people looking at the workings of history. But then you get a game which is essentially entertainment.
Yes.
Incredibly beautiful and well rendered components, but it's not meant to be 100% serious.
Right. And my son loved that. Because the visual,
all of it.
Yeah, the visual nature of it appealed toward it.
Yeah. Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, it is a very high quality product. But again, I would argue that if you don't approve of the way in which it treats things, leave it, park it, and let other people enjoy it and trust that they will enjoy it in an appropriate way.
100%. I'll dovetail that into B-17 Queen of the Skies. Comes out in 1983. It's the very first board game I get. It is not a simulation of the B-17's, real historical role. It's much more an amalgamation of everything that happened to kind of the crews throughout the entire war, with the game, but it's still a game. It's not a simulation. They've come out with a new version that gets more into the mechanical failures and the difficulties of landing, but the original game encapsulated for me 10 men in a plane working as a team going into a hostile area and then crawling to come back.
Mm.
And I'll get into more of that later, because that was where I had my first real kind of, at age 13, these visceral moments that I did not expect in board gaming and even in my mental picture of what war, how tragic war could be. But we'll come back to that in a little bit. We had Russ Sandbags came in. He actually had a question, and then Trevor had one too. Could you guys recommend a best or biggest wargaming convention to attend? Thanks for recommending Zones of Control. Cool book that references back to just a little book review I did a while ago. I'll do one real quick, just in my neck of woods, and then Paul, if you've got some in yours. I'm not sure where Russ lives. I will tell you the World Board Gaming Championships, the WBC. It grew out of Avalon Con. So they still play all these old Avalon Hill games, all the new stuff. They play stuff that's not war games. But I even went there once and was able to jump into a room of like 40 guys all playing B-17 Queen of the Skies, and it was really role played out. We did 3 missions together. There was an after action report, beautifully done. But that is one of the best places. But I'll also tell you, Board Game Geek convention happens twice a year down in Dallas. They have a whole wargaming hall where all these gamers line out what games they want to play. They link up. They're there for the week. So conventions as a whole, I think because of social media, have all become very easy to network and get those face-to-face games in. What do you have over in your neck of the woods, Paul?
Well, there are certain conventions that take place, mainly in London and Birmingham. We've got the 2 big exhibition centres. There's the NEC, the National Exhibition Centre, just outside Birmingham, which hosts events. And also one off the top of my head, I think is Salute, which usually takes place at I can't remember the name of it now, but it's in the Docklands area of London. But actually the one that I would highly recommend, because we're supposed to be living in an international world, and it's not that far to go if you live in Britain and you really are keen to take the family somewhere for a treat, is the Essen Games Fair. Now, the shop that I particularly relate to in London are always there each time it takes place. And the one thing they say about it is that it's a real family event. Whereas some games fairs in some places can be a little bit nerdy, a little bit comic book man. Yeah.
Very. I would say very. And I ensconce myself in nerd culture.
Yeah. But the Essen Games Fair, they say you always see family groups. There's lots of people there, and there's the kids going around with the parents, and it is treated as a proper day out. So that's the one, especially if children are involved, that for anyone that's watching from Europe or picks this up afterwards, the Essen Fair for me is probably a very important one to consider.
Now, I haven't been to the Essen Fair. It's more of an expo and a game buying experience, although they will have tables for demos. But a lot of the gameplay happens back in the hotels, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not a great expert on this, so I'm going to restrain my comments somewhat.
But I've never been there. I've just listened to media that's talked about. Yeah.
But I think probably the only bit of advice I would add to that is if you go and have a word, especially in my country, we still have game shops. Have a word with them and see where they say is a good place to go for an actual bona fide convention. I'm afraid I've got a better practice of that kind of thing.
Well, and I'll bring up while we're talking about it, Vassal, VASSAL, which stemmed out of fans of Advanced Squad Leader wanting to play online, and then it's expanded into all kinds of games, mostly war games. But Judd, who's on, who comes on the show all the time, he designs games, not designs. He codes games to be ported into Vassal, and he plays games on Vassal all the time. That's what the Ham Tag show.
Yeah. So
that's a great place. Now there's some, I used to play games on Vassal, and then they upgraded about 4 or 5 times. And now I just, because you can do a version of play by email. It's more like you do your turn and you email those results, and then that player opens that up and plays. And I haven't figured it out again. But it's a great way, especially if you want multiple games being played. you know, you can have basically virtual boards set up and you're playing people from all over the world at your leisure.
I can remember when I was young that Avalon Hill Games used to come with these explanations how to play this game by mail, and you should be able to buy a kit, but part of it was choosing a column on the New York Stock Exchange. So you got your results by looking at the figures on particular columns. We've come a long way since then, haven't we?
Yes, we have. I know exactly. I used to subscribe to the General, which was the magazine from Avalon Hill. And I lived up in the mountains of Colorado, did a lot of solo gaming, but I was always looking. And I remember just seeing, you know, there'd be people doing ads in the back. Hey, I'd like to play this game. Anybody want to hook up to play by mail? And yeah, we've come a very, very long way. Let's see. Trevor had one other comment here. It was back when we were talking about teaching games to kids. He said he thinks a lot of that teaching kids falls in the same line as there's parents who don't want their children taught sexual education. And it's kind of a parenting thing, or those that don't want war games being referenced. I'm trying to remember a topic, either by parents or others, otherwise maybe a little lost on the young adult. I think we were talking about parents that get real nervous about their kids playing war games. And I agree with you, living in a democracy, even if somebody, let's say they're a pacifist, and they don't want to touch movies or books or any kind of wargaming or anything, I fully support their right to do all of that. I just, I would ask if we were to sit down and have coffee, the pacifist and I, that it would be, oh, I'm curious why. And then, hey, here's why I do. It's not that I'm out, you know, it's not like I'm a berserker Viking, you know, that just looks for war. So,
Well, one last reference I'll make to this. One of the great British composers of the last century was a chap called Ralph Vaughan Williams. And Vaughan Williams served in the First World War. He was well over age, but he'd lost his friend George Butterworth at the Somme in 1916, and he volunteered. He was well into his 40s, in actual fact. And see, Vaughan Williams was someone who believed in his country, he believed in its way of life, but at the same time, he also believed in having a form of international institution that would prevent calamities like world wars beginning in the first place. But he certainly wasn't a pacifist. And one fellow composer of his from the later generation was a chap called Michael Tippett, who was a pacifist. And Vaughan Williams wrote in support of him during the Second World War as a kind of conscientious objector. But he did mildly rebuke Tippett, saying, well, look, you know, I've supported you through this, but the argument I'm still placing is, if all your writing materials and the manuscripts of your symphonies were in a house burning down, then you'd grab a bucket of water and do everything you could to save them.
Yes.
You know, and it's this thing that when you've got a kind of a regime that wants to exert itself on your way of life and your people, well, if you don't do anything, bad things are going to happen. It's controversial because we've all got different beliefs on these kind of things, but no, I do believe that the soldier does have an important role in society.
I agree. Now, speaking of controversial, and it dives right into, you brought up a topic, war in the Falklands. So Mayfair does a game while the conflict is literally still unfolding.
Yeah, I'm stretching my memory to remember this, but I do believe that it got onto television in my country while the Falklands War was on. I can remember, I mean, I bought it, so I mean, I can't kind of claim a holier than thou attitude for that.
Sure.
But if memory serves, it didn't help that the game had a buckets of dice system. It wasn't just about the Falklands War 1982. It also had a Falklands component from the 1914 sea battle. Okay. But of course, what attracted attention was the fact that it had this 1982 look at the Falklands. It hadn't got all the ships right because no one knew exactly what we had down there in total. Right. And it did cause a problem because the game, I think it looked rushed.
Mm.
I mean, I get more rushed than bringing a game out while I was still on. And it probably wasn't helpful publicity at the time. Now, of course, the Falklands has been the subject of numerous war games since that time.
Right.
Quite a few on the quiet.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, they're able to take a considered view of what the forces were. But I do seem to remember that at the time of the Falklands War, both while it was on and then immediately it was over, there were at least 2 games that I can think of that came out rather quickly.
Well, it leans toward Andean Abyss, which I have down there, and Labyrinth, which Labyrinth definitely is the war on terror and what's still going on even there. And I know that made some bumps in the news as well for the same reasons.
Well, of course, I mean, this is where you start getting on to issues which are linked partly to the fact that the gaming hobby, our simulation hobby, is much more ambitious today than it was in times gone by in terms of what it wants to cover. Now, there are certain subjects which people might automatically feel you can't do that, or you can only do it a certain way. Labyrinth comes under the description for me of one of those games that people might not feel comfortable about, in which case, again, you park it and put it to one side. It's a game which I would put alongside, because the target for a lot of what happens is effects on civilian populations. I don't think you can put it completely outside also of a system such as Bomber Command. Now, Bomber Command is by one of the really top designers in the hobby today, Lee Brimmick and Wood. But it is a game that how much planning you put into it and organizing Bomber Command raids, you still ultimately, we know what the history was. The history was that a lot of German civilians got killed in bombing raids organized by the RAF.
Right.
Now, people's opinions of that vary a great deal, from it was an absolutely necessary thing to do in terms of shortening the war, to arguments that it went too far and everything in between. Now, I have no problem with the game. Again, it falls again into that, well, if you don't like the subject matter, leave it, park it, and someone else can study it. And there is just more of that in the hobby today, because the hobby attempts more subjects. Now, where we perhaps get onto difficult ground is where you have games that specifically refer to terrorist causes, such as Labyrinth. Right. It also applies, I think, to, well, where it could crop up, and I think it was dealt with very well, is, I don't want to stay on this too long, but you have the issue of genocide. Now, the one that I would refer to, just to make an academic point, is what is said to have happened to the Armenians in the first half of the First World War. And it's a subject which I know plays very strongly today. And you've got one of your noted actresses in America, Angela Serafian, who recently appeared in a drama about events it's called 1915. Now, you have a game such as Osmanli Harbi, which is part of the De Weltkrieg series, which covers the Middle Eastern theatres of the First World War. And because it's a pure military game, it doesn't go near that subject. It doesn't need to. On the other hand, you have a game like Pursuit of Glory, and Pursuit of Glory certainly does touch carefully on the subject. The designer said that he didn't want to get, overly involved in it. And there are cases and defenses made either way. But he reduced it to, I think, 2 or 3 event cards where certain units have to be put on a map in a certain location, and just left it at that. It is an incredibly sensitive subject, and there you really cannot think of an approach other than restraint and care, and touch it if you feel the military model you're working with needs it, but then leave it. On the other hand, you can go to what you might call an elephant in the room of antiquity, which is Caesar's Gallic Wars. Now, I haven't played The Falling Sky, so I don't know if it refers to what went on in Gaul or not. But Caesar is often seen as having conducted a complete genocide against the civilizations and tribes of Gaul in the 50s BC. And a huge chunk of the Gaul population was wiped out. But of course, it's a long time ago. So does it make us feel different about it? I mean, the Roman Senate was ready to bring him back on war crimes. They were that appalled by it, which is saying something, considering how we regard Rome. But no, the subject is whether it is pertinent to the story that the game tells and whether you feel that the game itself has a relevance in the way it's being presented.
Well, on that point, I was just recently playing Battle of Britain. Did a review on it, but I will admit to, of course, you've got the Germans attacking England and the bombing of the cities in particular, and the RAF trying to stop it. Now it's all in game format, but when you draw a mission card, and that mission card is not to hit a radar installation, not to hit an airfield, it's to bomb an industrial location in a city, but we know that the bombs were not accurate and they just destroyed civilian populations in those areas. It's still, of course, historical, but I mean, knowing that your mission here is to go attack this city and to drop bombs on a civilian population. If there was a great game, I love it, but it crossed my mind even as I'm doing it. I've seen all the footage from the era, and the people hiding down in the subway systems, and I know you didn't mention this game in particular, but you even have lived in some of these cities that were hit during that time, or you had family that were there.
Yeah, I mean, even to the point where my mother was thrown under the coal cart by the coalmen during just after the Battle of Britain. It was during the time of the V1s and the V2s. But no, I mean, it's when you know a place and you have affection for your own home, to play a side which is trying to blow it up, well, I can't do it. That's right. Where I have a personal life. I would not at all complain about any decent treatment of the Battle of Britain as a subject, but sometimes I feel like I have to leave stuff alone.
Sure, and that pulls right in. I remember we'd talked in a prior live show, and you never named a game, but you'd mentioned there were some games that involved the bombing of cities where your family had lived, and you just didn't feel like playing those games.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's also like I lost a great-grandfather in the First World War in the North Sea, and I don't know what ship he was on. Family lost the papers. We've got his plaque, the metal plaque that servicemen got, but I don't know what ship he was on. And of course, I know when it happened. It happened in 1914. His ship was torpedoed. I have a horrible feeling it was one of the Hogue, Abukir or Cressy armored cruisers. If ever they appeared in a game form, I'd have to leave it alone. I couldn't do that. But that comes with the understanding that, well, what is it I'm playing? I'm playing games of war, and therefore I have to accept that, for someone somewhere, it's always going to be sensitive. It's always going to be an issue.
True. We've had some more people come on. We've got IRU80. Hello, guys from Spain. So hello to you, IRU. We've had Dan E., who's from Jersey. He's a big fan of my Scotch review show, of course.
All right, yeah.
Yeah, he says start the whiskey review. Well, we won't be doing that today, Dan. Mark Russell's in. He purchased Zones of Control. Excellent. I think it's an excellent wargaming.
It's a serious chunk of book, isn't it?
It is. It
Yeah.
very much is. And I haven't read it cover to cover. I have it sitting on a stand near the TV, and I will just occasionally pick it up and read a section. Mark Russell also says Mrs. Thatcher's War by White Dog Games is a good Falklands game. Let's see. Trevor says, thanks, guys. He's off. He's at that gaming conventions. He's off to play a Mega Memoir 44 with Richard Borg himself, Harold Buchanan, and his kids. We'll have fun with that. I'm sure Trevor's gone on. So Mark Russell says, greetings from Canada. And he's going through that game slowly. So it's good to have Russ Sandbags is also from Canada. So good. We've got a world connection going on here.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Let's see. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we talked just before we went on air about some issues to do with game packaging, and yeah, there we go.
Yeah, let me bring it up. So up front, so way back in the day, great game, card-driven game, but you can see we're featuring an SS officer right on the front.
Yes. Well, this is where I want to start bringing in two different themes here. Up front, ways in which companies can perturb people. Now, I didn't have a problem with the cover to up front, but I know that some people did. I can remember editions of the General where people had written in and said, how could you put that on the cover?
Mm-hmm.
Well, my answer to that would be is if you were going into a bookshop and you wanted to buy a book on SS Panzer divisions in Normandy, what do you expect to be on the cover? A vase of flowers?
Right.
You know, look, if you buy a game on the Gallic Wars, I talked about this with, this notion that Caesar embarked upon a genocide against the people of Gaul. But we put Julius Caesar all over the place. And if I go into a bookshop, and I will always equate a good historical war game with a good book study of the same subject, the things go on covers. I mean, I can buy, well, one of the first big history books I bought I was still a child, I was in my early teens, was William Shirer's Rise and Decline of the Third Reich.
Phenomenal book.
Yeah, huge book. And what did my copy have on it in Britain in 1973? Swastika.
Yep.
And I'll tell you something else. I can remember buying or having bought for me a little board game, family board game based on the Dad's Army comedy series. And, there were all those little cartoon renderings of Captain Mannering and Private Godfrey, but all the control markers were swastikas. And in fact, when the program was on in this country, it used to begin with the titles with these swastika arrows moving towards Britain. Well, no one looked at it as a kind of an endorsement of that kind of thing. It was just simply part of presenting a theme and a reality. So whilst I can understand why some people weren't keen on things like the cover of Up Front, for me, it wasn't an issue because it is part of the reality of what that war was about. Maybe they could have posed the soldier a different way, but that's about as far as it went. Ah, yes.
So skies above the Reich.
Yes, with its lurking swastika.
Yes, exactly. So if you look, the BF-109, if you look, always had the swastika on the tail. And sure enough, they kept it historic. The swastika is still there. Of course, can the game with this cover be sold in Germany now? You're not supposed to possess.
No, you're not.
So
see, the thing is, I really do not approve of this. It's virtually Orwellian in the sense that there's a line in 1984 that all history has become a palimpsest, and a palimpsest is a piece of vellum, it's a piece of parchment which can be constantly wiped clean. Now, I don't believe that it's ever a good idea to remove the landmarks of history. I mean, that's why, I've got a computer game called Atlantic Fleet, which you can fight naval actions from the Second World War, and you can do the Bismarck against Hood and Prince of Wales and whatnot. But of course, they've changed the German naval flag in order to take the swastika off it.
Right.
And the swastika and eagle that was on the back of the Bismarck, the eagle's still there, but the swastika's gone.
Right.
And, you think, all right, fine, fair enough. We don't want swastikas. Thank you very much. Yeah. But then there's the film that's just come out. Was it First Man? No American flag on the moon.
Oh, really? I haven't even seen or heard that.
Yeah, I picked it up. Well, I'm assuming it's correct. It was on the BBC News feed that the actor had defended the fact that the American flag isn't on the moon. Yeah,
that's something. Well, I'll give you. It's Civil War, and it's last year here in the States, but you had a lot of folks upset with all the different statues that were put up at big cities in the South after or during the Civil War, and they were wanting them removed. They're moving through the legislature to remove them. You know, the way it works is if somebody wants to move through the state legislature and have something removed and they find it offensive, I think let it go through the democratic process. I do not think it should be destroyed or melted down. If they don't want it parked in front of their city hall, fine. But I think it still has a historical value. And if someone were to say it shouldn't even be allowed in a museum, I would call foul at that point in time.
Yeah. I mean, my view on it is not to beat around the bush. Again, I don't approve of ripping up the landmarks of history.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, I don't approve in removing memorials to people who died in agony. Thirdly, I don't approve of people who seem to think that, and it's happened a little bit in my country as well, that if your city has major drug problems, crime problems, gun problems, gang problems, well, you can tear a statue down here and there, and then you'll wake up the next day and you've still got your gang problems and your gun problems and your this, that, and the other thing.
Right.
It doesn't make anything better.
Right.
It's basically a mob mentality. I mean, of course, the hobby over many, many years has been putting Confederate flags all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you do with an artist such as Don Troiani, who has, you know, made a name for himself over many years as a superb artist painting Civil War scenes, festooned with Confederate flags?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we've had a little bit of this in my country in a different context. But just as I wouldn't expect anyone to go around taking his pictures down if they were in a gallery or putting bits of tape over the flags, we had a picture in a British gallery, I believe in Manchester. It was a pre-Raphaelite painting, and because it had some young nude girls in it, it was taken down. And of course, everyone then put up these notes in the space where the painting had been, saying, "Put our bloody picture back." and it was a clever dick move by someone who thought that they were going to, make this statement about acceptable art.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, they completely overstepped the mark, and it was a silly gesture.
Right.
And again, out of step with what the reality of the subject was.
And again, the whole concept of a free democracy, freedom of speech, especially here in the States being, a core value. As law enforcement, part of what I've even had to enforce, we've got a group that's not far away that's, I consider a kooky far-right religious group. I won't even name them, but they love to come and protest and stand at schools or abortion clinics. And they say the most hateful and vile stuff. Gays can be in the military, so they will say placards and slogans that are extremely offensive. I don't like it. But the first test of a free society is not if, almost everyone agrees with what I'm saying, that's free speech. No, it's really that speech that I don't like. And I recognize, even as I'm standing there as a member of the government, that it's somewhat liberating that as much as I don't like what they're saying, and really the majority don't like what they're saying, but they still have a right to say it. And you should be offended. That's the test of a free society, is you hear what they have to say, weigh it for what it is, and really that's the test.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain things that I feel sometimes the hobby makes a rod for its own back. and people put themselves in positions that they can't maintain. Now, someone who did make a stand on a particular issue, and then it all seemed to kind of wasn't an issue anymore, was with the Panzer Grenadiers series from Avalanche Press. Now, Avalanche Press in particular, I think it was Mike Benninghoff, originally said that he didn't want the SS in the game, in the series. And he had his own reasons for that, and fair enough. If it's his company, if he doesn't want them, he doesn't want them. But then, of course, the rod for his back was, well, how do I do a Battle of the Bulge game on the Northern Shoulder without the SS units? How can I do a game about the Normandy beachheads and the fight in the Bocage if I haven't got any SS units?
Sure.
So he did put the SS units in. And then the thing that I find gratuitous is I don't need black SS units. The SS did not fight in black. It is a form of pantomime. They fought in camos, and that's the way in which they should be presented, or in a standard military color suiting the faction they're representing. But they're not parading around at a Nuremberg rally. They're fighting in hedgerows around the Russian steppe, and they did not fight in black. And I find that a bit silly. Other things, just kind of going back to this idea of how things get marketed. I'm sure that maybe sometimes you find that games don't get the support that you once hoped they were going to. And sure. This goes back a long way with me. I mean, we've picked up front and we talked about the cover. Well, let's talk about something else with it.
Sure.
There were 2 expansions. You've never heard of. There was Banzai and Desert War.
Yeah. I have Banzai. Yes.
Yes. Well, of course, I bought Banzai years ago, and I was all pleased because I got my Japanese soldiers and I got my British soldiers and their kit and equipment, and I've got some US Marines, and think, well, the Japanese are involved now, so we're going to go out to the Pacific and Asia and whatnot. Well, yes, but it was a very European-looking part of Asia, wasn't it? Because they didn't supply any new terrain cards,
right?
And it was a bother because you got into this chicken and egg. The argument, I think, was no new terrain cards because the game isn't selling well enough. It wasn't supported. Back in 1983-84, it wasn't supported well enough. The argument was. Well, of course, the other side of it is, well, people are not necessarily going to want to buy a game if they feel that, they're having to make do with stuff that doesn't really fit. I mean, if you had with Squad Leader, if the only thing that had ever come out for Squad Leader were the 4 original boards, but you were told, well, here's your British forces throughout the desert, so here's board 1 and board 2, but ignore all the buildings; they're not there anymore. But that's what they did with up front. It's kind of, you've got buildings cards. Well, it's dense jungle now. No, it's not. It's a building.
Yes.
And it was unfortunate, and it was disappointing. I think sometimes maybe companies, on the other hand, players can jump on their back for unwarranted reasons. And I'll stick with Avalon Hill with that. Turning Point Stalingrad. Now, Turning Point Stalingrad, the game that you bought in the box, covered the campaign, the battle from the German assaults that began about the end of the first week in September, or just after, through to fairly early in October. That's what the system worked best with, that semi-simultaneous area movement and combat system. Because if you wanted to fight the rest of the battle, you had to buy an expansion kit. And people bought the expansion kit, or some people felt that they shouldn't have had to buy the expansion kit. It should have all have been in the game anyway. What I felt as someone who got the expansion kit was it was a waste of time getting it, because the system didn't really work when you had the last remnants of a Russian defense all piled up in 2 or 3 areas, and all you had was a line of German units around them and a lot of die rolling. There was no game left. It wasn't what the system was there for. But there was quite a lot of hoo-ha about, well, we should have had the entirety of Stalingrad in the box to begin with. Well, it doesn't necessarily work like that.
Sure.
Which then brings us on to a company I have immense respect for, but I think it's worth raising a few things, which is Academy Games.
Now you and I are thinking on the same line. Continue.
Yes. Well, I've got a problem with Academy Games, and I'm going to kind of just gently wave a flag of devil's advocate here.
Okay.
They produce brilliant games, fantastic games. Conflict of Heroes is fantastic. The Birth of America series, I've got an awful lot of their stuff.
Love those.
Right now, and let's see if we are thinking on the same lines. Do you ever get the feeling they're taking 4 steps back for every 1 step they take forward?
Well, I think I know what are you talking about, how UVA will put forth the next game they want and then they'll change it or redo, or it's
the next game they want is the last game they did. Okay. And I mean that with more respect than it sounds, but you know, they started off with the Conflict of Heroes series. And apart from the fact that they wanted to change the box format, I couldn't see anything that was desperately wrong with it. But then they got a different graphic presentation. We got these ultra realistic graphics for the maps, and then they went to Guadalcanal and you couldn't see the hex grid.
That was my problem.
Yeah, I couldn't. You can't see it. Now, all right, I dare say you will be able to see it in Storms of Steel, which they're now remodeling.
Right.
The problem I have with all of this is, first of all, it looks like the remodeling of Storms of Steel also includes some extra functions, and they're putting in this special kind of dice, which means that, you know, again, I don't necessarily want higgledy-piggledy collections of series of games that are meant to be a series, where in order to keep the series up to date, I have to keep buying the same game again. The problem with Conflict of Heroes, I was hoping to see a game which I think was supposed to be on Pegasus Bridge by now, you know, the Normandy landing with the British powers, and it's kind of disappeared into the wide blue yonder.
Yes, I've actually asked about that because I think part of I think their own success has been part of the problem, and the fact that they floated out. I can't remember what the title's called, but they had a French 1940 or France 1940 Lowlands game that they want. There's the Normandy version with the cover with the guys parachuting in the dark. And I was just talking to Uwe because the second version of Storm Steel is supposed to be coming. What he's done is exactly what he's described it, that there's a lot of people complained about the caps, the command action points, and the APs. I always used a version with a double blind, 3 dice and a cup, and then we counted our APs up to keep things flowing. He's got a new system, and I'm going to have to look at it. The one thing I asked him is, can I still play the system the way I wanted to? And he was like, of course, there's nothing that changes any of that at all. So when I get this version to review, I'm definitely going to learn how to play it with this new system and see what that's like. And if he's preserved the ability for me to still play it with the dice cup rolling, the 3 dice and the means testing, and the counting up of the APs and the same use of the caps, as long as I can play it the way I want, I have no problem with additional options. I'm with you. I wouldn't want a complete overhaul where now it's game by name only in association.
Yeah, I mean, the other issue I do have with it is it uses up time. And time and monetary resources are not something that the hobby has in abundance. And the perspective that I would offer on this, just for people to think about, I'm not question saying it's got to be right, it's got to be my way. It's just the argument is, it's all very well up in the graphics and modifying the system. If you can find a way of modifying the system without necessarily changing the components, brilliant. The problem is, or the perspective I would put on it is, that nearly half a century ago, the incredible, great, highly revered tactical system poked its head above the trench. Squad Leader.
Mm-hmm.
What has Squad Leader changed in its presentation over 41 years? I thought you could take a bundle of squad leader units, I'm probably asking for trouble saying this, and some map boards back to 1977, go into a club and say, tell me which game this is from. And they'd recognize it. You know, they might have just got used to the system themselves. Yeah, there was the big change over to advanced squad leader and new bits and pieces coming in and this, that. But in terms of the actual look of the game, they've changed next to nothing. Whoever's had the game in 41 years. And has it hurt it? No. Right. So this is a little bit of the perspective. There are two tactical systems now, both of which have got old and new put together. One is Conflict of Heroes. Another, to a somewhat limited extent, is Band of Brothers. Mm-hmm. Because you could also buy a second edition of that with flashier maps. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not made of money. And I made the decision that, yeah, I bought all the stuff for it. But as I already had the older version of the first two games, the Ghost Division and Screaming Eagles, I wasn't going to spend money buying second edition, better looking stuff. And I'm afraid my maps will just have to stay the way they are. Although in all fairness to Worthington, they did provide, if you wanted to stick with the older system, you could still get the map that would present that way in the newer games. But it is this argument. You see, creative people, including wargame designers, can't resist fiddling with things. I do it with paintings. Sure. It's finished. No, it's not finished. No, I'll put another dab of paint there. I'll colour in this. And you do get this feeling that with wargame design, sometimes it's gilding the lily. You know, was it so terribly wrong the first time around? Maybe not. And it's used up time and it's used up resources.
Right. I agree. Eric Burden comes in and says Academy has a habit of announcing their next games and then you never, ever hear about them again. Or if you do, it's so much later that you stop caring. Yeah, I mean, they have the Gettysburg system that I was really excited about. They had the maps done, and it was going to be a 3-game system with one for each day. And now it's changed and morphed, and people were excited, and then it kind of withers on the vine. I agree, 100%.
It is. I mean, you know, it's just that I want to see new games. I don't want to see. Well, there's a famous line from the film, The Name of the Rose, constant sublime recapitulation. In other words, you keep going around in a circle looking at the same thing from different angles. I don't need that. What I do like is the notion of designers daring to do something different. Right. And this is where we talk about Mike Resch and 1914 Offensive à Outrance. Now, I don't agree with him. But what he did, if you look at virtually all the 1914 games that have come out over many years since the Great Granddaddy, 1914 itself, 1968, yeah, the BEF have always been the best units in the game. Not very many of them. I mean, Granddad in there somewhere, but yeah, not very many units. 2-3 units making up the core, and then a couple of support units. Best units, best highest ratings in the game. Mike Resch took another look at it and put forward the argument in the design with a few footnotes that the BEF was nowhere near as good as it was cracked up to be. And he marked it down quite severely in terms of how it functions in the game. Now, I feel that maybe he went too far. It's a bit of a while since I've seen the game, but I had the feeling that the British divisions in that game function less well than the Belgian divisions. The biggest objection I had to it was not the fact that my granddad was in that army. It was that when I heard veterans speak, and there's plenty of recordings of them, the veterans of 1914, there was an action fault with a chap called Roy Painting. He was a sergeant in the BEF, spoke about an assault across an open field where the BEF were moving against a German Jaeger battalion in a sunken lane. And they moved forward in this way that the British had built a renown for, fire and movement. One platoon firing, the other moving, and then they swap and they keep moving forward. and they captured this much larger German force. And of course, they talk like soldiers do. They captured the German unit and got talking to them, those that could speak English. Well, why didn't you? You know, you had a good position here. How did you muck it up? And they said, well, we couldn't get our heads above the bank. There was just too much fire coming in. And it wasn't the only account of that. You know, that they were excellent marksmen and they were highly tuned professional soldiers. And unlike virtually every other army that had fought in 1914, they were largely filled out with men with action somewhere, you know, because of the, you know, the nature of the British Empire, and there was always somewhere to fight somewhere.
No, great point. To circle back on one thing with Academy Games, I'll give them kudos for putting out Freedom, the Underground Railroad, and they took kind of a public hit from gamers that were not war gamers, saying you cannot do a game on slavery. Did you ever see that game?
I've certainly seen it. One of the comments I saw about it when it was being, you know, announced and it was due to come out was the problem about it. Well, if it's a two-player game, someone's got to play the slaveholders.
Although they got around that by making it cooperative. So everybody was working, through the mode of freeing the slaves, and the system played, slave catchers and the prevention. And then you had log jams basically on getting freed slaves up through different routes to try to get them to Canada. And the very gritty, tough part of the game, you had historical cards, of course, that would come in and play. But because of the system of log jams, you couldn't get as many slaves freed as you would like. And then your losing was, if you can't do this, they drop off. So they're either killed or moved further south or whatever. But I was amazed. I was at the Board Game Geek convention and people were playing it, and there were a lot of people that didn't think any aspect of it at all should be gamed, even though I thought the approach they did to this was done perfectly. I think it was the only way you could do it. The card system was so historical and teaching that they even have a compendium book that comes out with the game, and the game can be taught via homeschoolers or even in regular or private schools. And I thought the way they treated that was bold and extremely well done. I was a little bit stunned when people were upset by the topic. That was, other than war games, I'd never heard or seen anyone get so visceral on it. And that was one that people definitely did.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine that probably a lot of the opposition to it melted away on the basis of what you're saying, once people saw the reality of what the design was doing, which does lead to that belief, again, that there are probably no areas that the gaming hobby couldn't touch, well, perhaps with one or two exceptions, providing the treatment is correct.
Right.
Providing the approach is correct.
Right. Now, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things that I raised once or twice as a prospect for an historical simulation and model, it's not really a war game again in the strict sense, it'd be more like a labyrinth game or a coin game, would be a game covering the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Now, that is a very, very raw nerve with a lot of people, especially of course in my part of the world. But on the other hand, there are, you know, if we're going to do a game like Andean Abyss, which is full of, you know, bombs going off, and you've got terrorist organizations and FARC and whatnot, and you've got security forces, or if you've got, you know, labyrinth with the reality that someone is going to be playing a terrorist faction or a terrorist group or a worldwide terrorist network. You know, the reasons why, beyond the emotive stuff, the reasons why you couldn't do a game on events in Northern Ireland somewhat melt away if it was done correctly. Now, thankfully, up to a point, we live in a much happier era now with Northern Irish relations. But for many, many years, and I lived through it, and there were certain things that went on very close to where I lived that were very, very bad. But on the other hand, I would not, though I wouldn't necessarily want to play it, I would have no objection to someone doing a decent coverage of the 1940 Blitz. I would have no objection to people doing a particular kind of game that would deal with maybe trying to get POWs out of Europe, back into Britain. But of course, beyond wargaming, one of the very early games that I played when I was just cutting my teeth on this kind of thing was the old Escape from Colditz game.
Sure.
Yeah, which was just about getting out of the actual prison camp, but nevertheless, there was such a thing. I think there had been games on OSS activities as well.
Yes, you even have the very interesting game that I haven't played. It went out of print, but it's oh shoot, now I'm going to forget the name. Where you're cooperatively trying to kill Hitler.
Yeah, the plot to assassinate Hitler.
Yeah, and it's got
the old one.
They've got that brand new one though. It's
Black Orchestra.
Yes, Black Orchestra.
Yeah.
And I tried to get it when it first came out, and then of course it ran out, and they tweaked some things, fixed some verbiage, and put it out again or kickstarted again. But interesting that you're dealing with folks that they used all the real kind of caricature faces of the folks involved, knowing that I think I haven't played it with all the characters, but most of them are killed. On the attempt, and they get hung and tortured, and it's but I think again it was done right. It's far enough away that it's also good for folks that don't even know the history of that to say, whoa, all the Germans themselves had these assassination attempts on Hitler. Yeah, that really should change your opinion or mindset on even Germany wasn't fully unified on Hitler.
History itself is controversial. It is the moment you enter the historical arena for any reason, you are entering potential controversy, because you can't always even get people to agree on a set of facts and dates and things.
100%. Yep.
Two historians that I would mention, two British historians from a previous generation, who both encountered controversy in their own way. One was A.J.P. Taylor, who was a man from a very liberal wing in British social and political thought. But he wrote a book in, I think it was the late 60s or early 70s, on the origins of the Second World War, which described Hitler as a chancer, an opportunist, someone who would grab the main chance as and when it appeared, but not someone who planned to have the size of war that he eventually ended up with. But of course, he got jumped on for that because he was accused of apologizing or an apologist for Hitler, or that he was downplaying the extent of what happened. But of course he wasn't. He was interpreting a set of events in a particular way. Another historian from a more conservative point of view, who in his own way encountered controversy, was a chap called Corelli Barnett. Now, Corelli Barnett wrote one I regard as one of the all-time great British history books, The Collapse of British Power, which he wrote in the early 70s. But back in the 60s, he was one of the writers for a series called The Great War, which is a BBC series. It's one of the all-time great documentary series. I would recommend it to anyone. Maybe over half a century old, but it's still brilliant.
Wow. Okay.
And it is, honestly, it is that good. The narration was done by Sir Michael Redgrave, and it became very much the model for the later World at War, the famous series from the early 70s. But in the Great War, it was said in the documentaries afterwards that there was a tension between the historians who felt that the First World War was the calamity, the disaster, the great tragedy, the war that was fought for no good reason, with the British generals all being complete idiots who didn't know what they were doing, and people like Corelli Barnett, who thought the war was worthwhile, still hideous, still horrible, but was fought for very good reasons, and that if it had been fought a bit better for a bit longer, we wouldn't have got the Second World War. And there was this tension, this because you couldn't have it both ways easily within a documentary presentation. And there was this difference of opinion. Now, I started off as someone who thought the British generals were all idiots. I've changed my mind about that quite a lot. One of the things that helped bring that to mind is a simple statistic that close to 60 British generals died in action during the First World War, most of whom died on the Western Front. And it's, again, we get this channeled view of particular events, and swimming against the tide of that, whether you're doing it in a war game design or in a book, is sometimes very, very difficult.
A couple comments that came in. We'll go with, well, let's do Bill Broadhurst first. Says, any thoughts on Lock and Load Tactical? They come out with fancy maps, updated rule sets, but I believe you can keep the base game. What are your thoughts on this?
I haven't bought any Lock and Load for a long time. Not because I don't like it, but because I bought it all when it was in its earlier incarnations. And again, it is this issue about, well, do you feel pressured to get the latest, better version of a particular product? I might do if it's a substantial leap on, and I feel that it's so obviously better to something I've already got, but otherwise I'm resistant to it. I would rather save my money for a brand new product on a brand new subject.
And I had an issue. I was searching. I love tactical war games, World War II, and I was searching for which one I wanted to kind of go all in on. It ended up being Conflict of Heroes, but I tried the Lock and Load game. I can't remember the name of it, and I got it. And the board had what I call chicken wire hex lines. They had decided there was a new type of board system, and they used like a white halo system around each of the hexes. And it looked like you overlaid it with chicken wire, and my eyes kept, well, for example, if you play Settlers of Catan, or they call it Catan now, your roads move along your hex lines. It's your movement is along the bisections of the hexes, and the hex just denotes. And in a war game, usually I'm always focused on the hex and not the lines, but here they made the lines where my eye, for whatever reason, gravitated toward the lines and not the hexes, and I found it extremely difficult to play. I brought it up at, well, I knew they got enough pushback that they ended up dropping those types of boards, and in a future deal, they came out with the maps that had the typical black lines. Well, I happened to run into them at a convention, not them, a representative. I don't know who I was talking to there. And I said, is there any chance where you'll put these new boards out so I can even buy them? I cannot stand this chicken wire board. And unfortunately, and maybe it's wrong on my part, but the person at the counter at the expo said, a lot of people like them. We're not doing that. And I'm like, well, they didn't like them enough for you to keep producing them. You got new boards. Do you have a damaged box where I could buy the board out of it even? Nope. And it was real dismissive. And for me, it was kind of like, there are so many tactical World War II board games, I will pass on this one. And that was me. So it's not a fault necessarily with the system. It was more of a fault with, I felt I bought a game that was so distracted by its visual layout, and then I didn't like the customer service.
And there's a lot of games these days, aren't there? I mean, it's one issue I sometimes wonder about, and it gets mentioned to me from friends in America in emails, is keeping up with the huge output of games these days. I mean, it sounds like such a positive.
Oh, yeah.
But there is this side to it where it's a feast that famishes.
And there'll probably be a bursting of the bubble sooner or later. What I do like is I do think we're in the golden age. Wargaming alone is a niche within a niche, but then you can have tactical wargaming or strategic level or card-based. So I'm enjoying where we're at now. I wonder if the bubble will burst at some point in time. And let me get to a couple questions from Eric Burden. Are there any wargaming themes you think are not appropriate? What's your thoughts, Paul?
Anything that would touch directly upon the process of mass slaughter.
Okay, I would agree.
I put it as bluntly as that. I mean, I think that sometimes you have to brush against it, and sometimes it's obviously a reality that's lurking in the background. But I would not want to play. I don't even want to talk about it too much. I'm sure people understand why. I don't want to play a game where I would be called upon to allocate resources to a specific slaughter.
Sure. I know there was a psychologist, not a game designer, not a company, psychologist that created a game called Trains, I think was the name. And you start off where you're just trying to organize trains and get them coming and going and flowing more and more smoothly. And as the game goes on, the psychologist in a game in a university type situation reveals that what you're really doing is playing like commandant or whatever, and what you've been doing is trying to effectively send the Jews to Auschwitz and different camps. And of course, people were infuriated, or how long did they play? What did they do when they stopped or figured it out? What was their emotional? So it was more of a psychological study. And that is a game, if I don't think it would ever be published anyway. I again would totally recognize what the psychologist is doing, because I think it was a woman. She used the system to trick them and then to see how they felt about what they had been exposed to. Again, I'm with you. I don't think it would ever be produced at all. I would defend that psychologist's right to have a system, in this case, a gaming system, that pushed against her students and tried to make it real and kind of set them up for the discussions that she then had. But I agree with you 100%. We have Eric Burden says, as far as tactical World War II games are concerned, is ASL still the gold standard these days? I don't think it is, but I also know Greg Schmickens, who loves it, and it is definitely his gold standard.
For me, it was virtually unchallenged for a long, long time. Now I feel it's more a question of where your preference lies in terms of what level of complexity you want. I don't buy the notion that realism, I think I said this before, that realism necessarily troops alongside hand in hand with complexity. That's why I think Upfront was at its best with its first 10 pages of rules, when it was two squads meeting in an anonymous piece of countryside. Everything else it tried to do was part of the issue of gilding the lily. Didn't need tanks, didn't need encirclements, didn't need infiltration, didn't need a lot of things. It was simply cards, squad, can I do this, can't I do this? Damn it, I've got the card, but I haven't got the movement to get there, or I've got the movement, but I've got nowhere to go.
And I loved how they did the fog of war, in that as a soldier, I was a medic in a light infantry unit. You didn't know what the terrain was 600 yards ahead off to your right flank.
No.
Back then, you didn't know if you were going to run into a stream or a hill or a forest.
Yeah, I mean, the only other game that I know of that uses cards in something like the same way is Fields of Fire. But the scope of that game is far greater, and it's looking at things from a different scale. You're never so much in the squad as trying to pick the phone up and work out what on earth is going on 300 yards down a lane.
Sure. Eric has another question. How do you feel playing as the Germans versus the Russians? Is it okay or in a game, to hope the Germans will win in these types of games? I would say, sure, it's okay to hope anybody wins on any side. I've never had a problem playing either side. I will also tell you, history is the lesson. The Russians, although they were our allies, they had been responsible for millions upon millions of deaths as well. And I think that would lead you down a broader line of you can't always believe the history that comes out of the victor as well. And that's where you've got to have the system that can challenge itself, or allow individuals within a country to challenge what the historical narrative is. I could see, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that I will go back to an answer I gave a little earlier, or sometime earlier, about trusting people to work with materials and then park them.
Yeah.
So I got no problem playing the Germans. I got no problem playing the Soviet Union. And then once I played it and enjoyed victory or enjoyed the experience, even if I've lost, I park it.
Right.
The other thing I would refer to with that was I was at pains when I wrote the historical notes to Moscow 41, the Vento Nuevo game. I was talking about the German newsreels, which, quite apart from showing victorious panzers pushing further east, they stopped off at some place in a Russian village somewhere and they photographed or they filmed some Russian kids who were shaking and just looking completely bewildered. And, you know, I just looked at them, they were absolutely terrified. So, yeah, I can play a game, but I was if everything that I believe in is in the notes, they sound like a bit of self-promotion now, that I've just written, or I wrote for the game that's just come out, the Stalingrad Inferno on the Volga. And there have been a lot of great notes written for Stalingrad games over the years. I try to do something different. So there's plenty of strategy and talk about what goes on and how one side lost and the other side won. But without giving the game away, there is something very, very different in those notes as well.
Brilliant. Let me hit on a couple items and then we'll look at questions one last time. We'll wrap it up because I know we both have things we got to do. I hear my kids moving around upstairs. You have a note here, annoying playing habits. Are we open to innovation in lesser known subjects? And if you want to expand on that a little bit.
I don't like gamey things. I will avoid, like the plague, anyone who wants to do silly flipping things just because the game system lets them. I can remember seeing, and I mustn't overly condemn them because I can't be absolutely certain what they were doing, but there's some video online that I will say that is to do with one of the games that I know on a subject I love, and you see some moves being played and things are whizzing around in totally unrealistic ways just because the system will let you do it. But any notion of, well, actually, that's not an alternative strategy. It's just bilge. That would never happen. I don't like playing games where that kind of thing goes on. Open to alternative subjects, yet very much. I'm hoping to get my hands on Maori Wars before too long. Which, of course, is in the fine old tradition of Legion War games that has always been ready to tackle those obscure subjects and do an incredible job with them.
And I'll move into when war games can truly open your eyes. And it's also been something that some hardcore war gamers didn't like. And I'll point back to my first game, B-17, Queen of the Skies. So it is way more game than simulation. And there are not a lot of player decisions that you're moving through. And that's where a lot of war gamers I meet even today are like, you rolled, you checked the chart, you rolled, you checked a further chart, maybe you checked one more, and then something happened. Where was my decision space? There's very little, actually. So from a game standpoint, I actually think if you just look at the bare bones mechanics, it's actually pretty weak. But then the idea that 40 people show up at the World Board Gaming Championships and they sit down in a room together and they engage and they play and they do 3 flights and this goes on year after year and they do an after action report, it came much closer to 1, role playing. You have names for every one of your crew members. And then 2, the part where I think it succeeds as a war game was it's less about one plane, the name on the plane and the guys in it. And when you play as many games as I did and created my own flight squadrons and ran them on group missions, it was much more about a grand overall understanding of what did happen to the men that were on the planes and the heroics and the losses and the tragedies and a favorite plane that's made it 8 or 9 missions, maybe 10, and all of a sudden it takes one hit to the bomb bay and the entire plane's gone, the crew's gone, and the beautifulness of the game able to give me an emotional hit and to realize that quick gone, and that I had some time invested. And then to think this happened to individuals, and then it led me to read, excuse me, it led me to read more and understand more, and it allowed me to feel more. And that was something, again, I was 13 when I was playing this game. And I believe that most 13, 14-year-olds, I'm not saying none, but most would not have that internal respect for actually the tragedies of war.
Mm. For me, the one that I would offer up, or actually it's two games. One is Republic of Rome, the 1990 game from Avalon Hill, and the other one is the much more recent Time of Crisis. Now, the reason why I would put those two together, if you're interested in the processes of history and understanding human life and the tragedy of human civilization, the Republican Romans were a very, very tough bunch of gits. They really were. They suffered massive defeats and had this remarkable ability to keep dusting themselves off and going at, they wore their enemies out, such as Hannibal. Then you have Time of Crisis. It's Rome. Rome has this far bigger empire. On paper, it's got far more resources than it ever had as a city republic. And yet it's making deals. It's prevaricating. It's falling apart. Time of Crisis tells the story of corruption, of a failing military, of a massive empire that, despite the fact that it has now made all of its free population a citizen of that empire, finds it very difficult to defend itself and very difficult to deal with challenges that the Republican Romans were able to deal with and face up to with a very, very tough attitude. And throughout the wargaming hobby, you will find associations between games, if you look, that they can open your eyes in different ways and offer their own perspectives on very important aspects of history. Because I firmly believe that very little in this world is ever really happening for the first time.
Yeah, I agree.
Happened before.
Yes.
It's just a question of picking up the threads.
Right. I agree. Let's get to a couple questions and then we'll wrap this up. It's been very, very entertaining for me, Paul, again.
Thank you.
Let me see here. Where did I leave off? Okay, Mark Russell says, I just received Stalingrad Inferno on the Volga. Looking forward to reading the historical bundle even more now. He's very excited. Let's see. Mark Russell, what are Paul's thoughts on Stalingrad Inferno on the Volga? What do you want to share on that?
Well, who would have thought that you could do a decent game on Stalingrad with a playing time of an hour? Mm-hmm. That's one thing to say about it. Secondly, I've intimated in one or two forum pages that it was the first time I really got an insight and a feel to how much work goes into a quality game. Because I wrote the notes. I wrote the historical notes last autumn. And if at the same time I was writing the notes, there was Emanuele in Italy putting this map together in tiny little slices, this incredibly detailed map. And then we had to work on the translations, the Russian to the German to the English, and actually finding the right and apposite term for all these historical locations. It's a game which I hope will entertain. It will do that job of being an entertaining and insightful game on the subject. On my contribution to it, I read the historical notes to two people, to my wife and to my wife's principal carer and a good friend of ours. And I just read them in my normal reading tone. Both of them were in tears at the end. Mm. Now, I know that's different. I know that's not what people normally expect from a set of notes. But this was, at a level, a terrible, terrible battle and a terrible, terrible war. And without wanting to put a cold blanket or wet blanket on people's aspirations on game playing, I just wanted that element in the notes that would say, this is the reality of what happened.
Mm.
And so please don't go into the notes thinking it's going to be a complete kind of depressing read, because it's not. There's sarcasm, there's bite, there's areas where there is standard historical analysis, but the notes are in the present tense and they regularly feature one particular soldier.
Wow. Now I'm very intrigued. All right, let's see. Eric Burden has a couple questions, and we'll get to Mark's last one here, and then we'll wrap it up. So Eric says, can you list your top 3 games you're either playing or looking forward to playing soon? And would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm afraid one thing that they've all got in common, they're all American Revolution games. Something that I've suddenly found myself with an immense desire to get involved into. So I'm going to be playing either Pensacola or Newton and Oryxani from the Battles of the American Revolution series from GMT. I want to be playing Liberty from Columbia, and it's about time I also played Liberty or Death, the GMT game.
Sure.
It's a subject that I've seriously got interested in.
I've got Hitler's Reich on the table right now from GMT. So I'm working through that. It's a very different kind of game. I'll mention on a side note, my current gaming war game style is I'm really enjoying light and fast entry, and a lot of, even when you mention the Stalingrad game taking an hour, that's where my operating space is, with 2 kids, 11 and 9, and all the things I'm doing. So that's been a big one. I've been playing a game called Untold Adventures Await, which is from a base of Rory Story Cubes out of England. And my son loves this story making game so much. We've got a Star Wars theme thing going on, and it really just sets up storytelling and plot making with a role-playing light-esque, that when I'm coming home from work, he's like, Dad, we got to play.
Oh, bless him.
Yeah, I'll take that all day long, and it could be morphed into anything. So it's not really war game related, but it's story based. Let's see. And then oddly enough, Gloomhaven, which I have, and I have not opened that beast up. And I look,
lots in it, I'll tell you.
there is a whole lot. I've looked at it, fiddled with it. There is so much gameplay in there. And part of my deal is I'll have game reviews going on, and that'll obviously take a lot of my time, but I've almost caught up. And that's, I told my son we would get into to trying that one out here soon. So that's where I'm at. Let's see. Eric Burden says, B-17, Queen of the Skies. I'm trying to figure out a way to bring the game into my classroom this year. It's a great game. That is wonderful. If you're teaching history, I think you could set up a plane. I don't know, depend on the age. I think it's good to have an understanding of a feeling of real people are in the planes. It might be hard in a classroom to realize that Johnny's just died. So that would be my only caution there. Let's see. Mark Russell, so happy that I kickstarted that game. I believe he's talking the Stalingrad game, going to be playing it solitaire. And the one more question showed up from John Praderak. I probably mispronounced your last name. Sorry, John. Do people not mention Target 4 today because the nostalgia for B-17, Queen of the Skies, or is it just not as good? I've got TFT because the other is out of print. I can answer that, and I will, but Paul, do you have an opinion on that?
Okay, well, it's a far more technical game. It's got a massive emphasis on realism. And I'm guessing that the stats would work out to a more accurate presentation of a 25 mission round and your chances of surviving it. It's horses for courses, as we would say in my country. You play B-17 Queen of the Skies for entertainment and having a blast or being blasted at. You play Target for today to work with a higher level of statistical realism, and there's room for both.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. That's exactly where I'm at. I believe it is. It's a much more simulation. The mechanicals in there. The weather's much more important. The landing and again the mechanical elements. You've nailed it. I believe that is the difference. One, I believe, is much more. Well, I'll just B-17 Queen of the Skies. I believe is much more game and entertainment and feeling. It's almost like a comic book story, or even any story, a movie where they have to collapse, 15 characters in real life, but we can't have that many on screen, so we're going to collapse people into this, and now we only have 8 characters and we can tell the story.
Yeah.
And that is the difference. I believe it's what will keep B-17 Queen of the Skies alive. It's more of a story game than a simulation, and Target for today, I believe, is way more on the simulation side. I think you've hit it. Mark Russell says, thanks, Bart and Paul. Very entertaining. Larry P says, great show. Thank you. Paul, anything you want to add before we sign off?
Well, I just want to talk about some of the projects that I've been involved in very recently. We've already talked about Vento Nuevo. I've been very fortunate to work on some peripheral things with a game called Napoleon 1807. Napoleon 1806 from Shakos Games and Golden Bell Entertainment. My opinion, one of the most brilliant games released so far in the last 12 months. The 1807 game promises to be even better. Mm-hmm. And yourself, I know you did a very good review of Trafalgar Edition's Waterloo game.
Yes.
Well, I've seen a lot of the materials now for their Austerlitz game, which will be using the same system. There was going to be a few little twists and nuances there. They brought the fog in and different notions about how you maneuver in the early stages of the game. I've offered some suggestions on that. Still great things coming out of Europe, and still a wonderful, wonderful hobby to be involved in. And I've never regretted that. When I was 12 years old, I stood in a particular large toy shop in London, saw these games, refused to get put off by the buzzing old woman that was standing around trying to get me out of the way, held my ground, and started on decades and decades of enjoyment.
Beautiful. And I will come back. John has broken out how I should pronounce his name. It's Patoric, and he says it's totally okay. It's a Ukrainian name. And he says, thanks, awesome answer. So thank you, John, and thank you for letting me get it right. We'll sign off. Thanks to all the fans. Paul, stay on the line. Last time I think I ended the broadcast, I hit the complete kill button, and we didn't get a chance to chat. I'm moving toward just stop the broadcast. So thanks to all the fans. Thanks for all the great comments, and thanks, Paul, for
everyone.
Hang on the line, Paul. I'm stopping.